How to sew the Barn Gazing Quilt with Amber Makes. Make this stunning barn gazing quilt. Arrange your log cabin blocks in the barn raising pattern and add some stars for that extra wow factor. Cutting out. Start by labelling all your fabrics. This is fabric A, which is used for the centre square. Then I've chosen 6 light fabrics, which are fabric B, C, D, E and F, and you can see I've labelled them with the letter, and G as well. They're all labelled with the letter. And then there are 6 dark pink print fabrics, H, I, J, K and L and M. And if you organise them all like this, it's a lot easier when you're cutting out to know which fabric is which. And then fabric N is the plain fabric that's used for the stars. Now you need to cut the fabrics. We're going to start by cutting the fabrics into strips. This is the fabric that's used for the centre square. Line the top edge of your fabric along the line of your cutting mat, so it's straight horizontally. And then trim off the edge using the lines on your cutting mat and your ruler so that you've got a nice straight edge and a right angle to start with. All of these fabrics that we're cutting, we're going to first cut into strips and then we're going to subcut them. So line up the 2.5 inch mark, because that's the width of the strip for this, and cut it. Now if you move your ruler to the 5 inch mark, that would be another 2.5 inch strip, and then move the ruler again. Because I've got an 8.5 inch ruler, I'll move it to the 7.5 inch strip. But if your ruler is narrower than this, just keep moving it to cut 2.5 inch strips. And then you can cut the remainder. All the measurements and the number of strips that you need are all listed in the instructions. So follow them very carefully to first cut out all of these strips. Now I'm cutting these across the width of the fat quarter because that's what the centre fabric is. All the other fabrics are in 1/2 metre, so you'll cut them across the whole width of the metre. So that piece you can put to one side. Now you need to subcut the strips. So take the strips and lay them horizontally so they match up the cut line with the line on your cutting mat, and then you can be sure that you're cutting them square. So you can lay them like this, one below the other, making sure that they're exactly straight along the horizontal line, because it's important that you do this and then you will cut perfectly pieced right angled squares. So I'm going to lay that bottom one along the line of the mat. Then I'm going to put another one on top because there are 5 of these strips and I want to cut all 5 strips at once. So if you lay them on top of each other like this, you can cut more than 2 layers, but I find I only like to cut 2 layers at once. It just makes it more accurate. So there's all my 5 strips, all lined up horizontally with the lines on the cutting mat. So the first thing you need to do is just cut over those selvages. Make sure you cut sort of 1/4 inch to the right of them so that you make sure all the selvage is gone and any of the little pin marks that are in the fabric for when they're printing it. So just remove those selvages, and then you've got a nice straight edge to start with. You can now subcut into the sizes given in the measurements. For each of the fabrics, these sizes are different. So it's very important that you follow the instructions. Some are 2.5, some 4.5, all different measurements. So just cut them into the width measurements shown. And continue like this. Now I've cut all of my centre squares. So write or print out a label and pin or clip it and clip them all together, and then you will know those are the centre squares. You may have some pieces left over from the sub-cutting, but just cut them like this. This is the next fabric we're going to cut. Now this is cut across the whole width of the fabric, so I've folded it in half and I'm lining up the fold on the horizontal line of my cutting mat. Again, trim off the selvage to start with so that you've got a nice right angled end. When your fabric is supplied, if it's supplied like this, it will be folded in half already. So give it a press and make sure that fold is on the edge. Make sure the fold is level rather than the selvages. And then subcut that. Cut that all into the strips just like you did before. But you can either keep them folded in half and cut across them, or you can open them out and cut across them. It's up to you, and it also depends on how many strips you're cutting. So once you've done that, there's the centre squares all labelled that I just cut. There's all strip 1, strip 2, and you can see if you label them and pin them on, again you can print them out, or you can just write the words onto a piece of paper I've clipped mine together because there were quite a lot in each pile and the pins wouldn't go through, but you can pin them if you prefer. So here's all the 6, 7, 8. If you keep yourself organised like this, you'll find it a lot easier when assembling. There's 9. Now with strip 10, it's separated into sections because there are different blocks. So there's the whole block, the pieces for the 1 corner blocks, the 3 corner blocks and the 4 corner blocks. When you make the quilt in a moment, you will see why you've got these different blocks. There's strip 11, whole block, 1 corner block, 3 corner block and 4 corner block. And then finally strip 12, whole block, 1 corner block, 3 corner block and 4 corner block. I've cut all the plain fabric that I'm going to use for the stars. Some of them are squares and some of them are rectangles. Again, I've labelled them and clipped them all together. Making the blocks. There are 4 different sorts of blocks we're going to make, and we're going to start by making a whole block. So take all the pieces for 1 whole block. These pieces numbers are listed in the instructions for you. So you need the centre square, then strip 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Remember, you labelled all these at the beginning so you'll know which is which. Strip 10 whole block, strip 11 whole block and strip 12 whole block. So make sure you take the whole block pieces. The other pieces are the same for all blocks. So let's start by sewing the centre square and strip 1 together. So sew them together, place them right sides facing and sew them together along the top edge of the centre square and the bottom edge of strip 1. Pin them together and then sew. Once that's done, open them out, and I like to press the seam towards the strip that I've just sewn on. So I'm pressing the seam towards strip 1. Now take strip 2 and place that on the right hand side, place it right sides facing, and I'm going to turn it over because I always like to sew with the seam on top, and that means that I can make sure that I sew it so that it's still facing the way that I've pressed it. If you have it underneath, it can sometimes get twisted. Pop a pin in to hold that seam in place and then sew together. Once that's done, press to set the seam, open them up, and then press the seam over to one side towards strip 2. You can press them open if you prefer. I just find this easier and neater. Then turn it the right way up again, so strip centre squares at the bottom and strip 1 at the top, and then take strip 3, place that along the bottom edge, right sides facing, turn them over so that the seamed edge is on top. The great thing about these log cabins is there is no seam matching when you're making the blocks, because you're always sewing a non-seam piece to a seam piece. Sew together, making sure that seam doesn't get twisted. Press the seam to set, and then press it over to one side. Turn it round again so that your block is facing the right way up. Then take strip 4 and place that on the left-hand side. Again, right sides facing. Turn it over so the seamed side is up. Pin together at one end and then pin together at the other end. It's very important that the raw edges all match up at the top and the sides. Now your strips are getting longer, so to make sure it fits, I push a pin through my ironing mat or board to hold it and then pull it at the other end, and then it will fit because the seams pull the fabric in slightly. If you just put pins in like this, then you just in vertically, then you can push them in through the fabrics. Stitch the seam, press to set, open it up and then press it towards the seam you've just stitched. Turn it around again so you've got the centre in the centre. Take strip 5 and place that along the top edge. Right sides facing, turn it over, making sure the raw edges at the top and the sides match up. Pin together. It's very important that all these raw edges match up because you've cut your strips to exactly the right size. They will always fit. So if you make sure it matches up, you will have a perfect finish. Push the pins in through the seams and then push the pins through the fabric. You can take out that holding pin now and sew together. Press the seam to set and then press the fabric over to one side. Make sure your block's facing the right direction. take strip 6 and place that along the right hand side. So you can see now we're always working in a clockwise direction. So we go top, right, bottom, left, top, right, bottom, left. In the instructions, there are diagrams of the whole block so that you can refer to them as you go. And that diagram is numbered as well. So it tells you which strip goes where in the block. It's always worth, particularly when you're making your first block, to check as you go along against the diagram to make sure that you're stitching everything in the right order. But if you always work clockwise and always turn your block round so it's facing the right way, then you will get a better finish. Press the seam again to set, because the seam disturbs the fabric, and then press it over to one side. Turn the block round so it's facing the right way. Take strip 7, place that along the bottom. Right side's facing, turn it over so the seams are uppermost. Pin together at one end, pin together at the other end. Push a holding pin through and then pull the other end so that the whole thing fits, and then push pins through the seams, and then you can put the pins through. Remove the holding pin, stitch together, press to set the seam, and open up and press the seam over to one side towards the strip you've just attached. Turn it so the block's the right way up, and then strip 8 goes along the left hand side. So you can see we're repeating the same process all the time. As it gets longer and the strips get longer, you'll need to put more pins in, but always pin at either end matching the raw edges, and then push that holding pin through. That's why I always like to do my pin on an ironing board or mat, because then you can push the pins in. I'm going to put one in the centre this time because it's getting longer. It's so much easier to sew it if you've pinned it together all in place first, and then just sew it down. Press the seam to set it, and then press the seam over to one side. Turn the block round so that the centre square's in the middle and strip 1's at the top, as before. Now take strip 9, place that across the top. Turn it over so the seams are uppermost. Pin at either end. You don't need to pull it very much, it's just that where you've sewn, the seams pull the fabric in a little bit, and because all the strips are cut to exactly the right size, if you find your strip really isn't fitting, then just double check that you've cut it to the right length. It's easy sometimes to cut it to the wrong length, so just do double check that. Press the seam to set, and then press it over. Now we're going to put strip 10 on the right hand side. So remember, this is strip 10 whole block. So with the whole block strips, they're exactly the same length. We're not adding any stars to these. So the other blocks have the star squares and rectangles added in them, but with the whole blocks, these go on the outer edges of your quilt. There are no stars sewn in, so that's why it's best to start with whole blocks, because then you'll understand and repeat and practice the log cabin method, so that when you do the other blocks, which have the star sections in them, you'll find it much easier. Stitch together, press the seam, and then fold it over and press the seam over to one side. Turn the block round and take strip 11 and place that along the bottom edge. Turn it over so that the seams are uppermost. And you can see everything's getting a lot longer now, and you'll need to put more pins in. So I always like to put pins in to hold the seams so that they're pressed over to the side I've pressed them, and then I just put more pins between them depending on the length of the strip. But it is easier when you're sewing if you've pinned those seams into place. Sew together. press the seam to set it, and then press it over to one side. Turn the whole block round, and then the final strip is strip 12. And that goes along the left-hand side. So you can see now that we're building up with all the light coloured strips are on the right and all the dark coloured strips are on the left. And the reason for that is that when you then join all the blocks together, you get the pattern. And with this quilt, we've arranged them in the barn raising pattern, which is a traditional log cabin pattern, which creates almost a star shape. There are lots of different patterns and arrangements you can use for log cabin, but this barn raising pattern is one of the most traditional, and it works really well where I've added the stars in. But all the blocks when you make log cabin are always the same. You have dark on one side and light on another. So pin it together. So press the seam to set it. And then give it a press over to one side, and your whole block is now finished. Now you need to repeat this to make 12 whole blocks in total. I would make one whole block to start with, and then if you want to, you can chain piece by putting all the strips on in order if you want, or you can make one whole block at a time. Making a one corner block. So this time take all the pieces for the one corner block and join them all together until you've got strip 8 pieces on, and then take a strip 9 piece, a strip 10 one corner block piece, one strip 11 one corner block, and one strip 12 corner block, and that's for making the rest of it. You'll also need a star square and a star rectangle. So let's start by making strip 9. We're going to attach making the star piece on here. So take your star square and draw a diagonal line on the wrong side from one corner to the other. If you're using a plain fabric like this, there isn't a right side and a wrong side, but if you're using another fabric, then make sure it's on the wrong side. Now with strip 9 lying horizontally, place the square on the right hand side, matching up the side and the raw edges. Pin the square in place. Pin either side of the line so that you can keep the pins in while you're sewing, and then sew together along that drawn line. Once that's done, press it to just set the seam, and then fold the square over so that the corner matches the corner of the strip like this. And that just means if you press it before you cut it, then you'll make sure it's nice and even. Now trim the seam allowance so it's about 1/4 inch outside of the line. And you've now cut off the corner, you've snowballed the corner. There are more detailed instructions for snowballing a corner in the instructions that come with your kit. Now take your block that you've joined together, the centre and strips 1 to 8, and place strip 9 across the top, and then place it down right sides facing. Now you need to match the seam allowances here, so just put a pin 1/4 inch down from the seam and then 1/4 inch through the seam below, and that just means that the seam that you've sewn the square to will match up with the seam below. And then pin it together at one end and pin it together at the other end, making sure the raw edges match. And then just like you did when you were making the whole blocks, put some holding pins in then to make sure it's all matching up. And then where you've matched those seams, place a pin through the fabrics and then take the pin out, and you can be sure those seams match. And then pin it together and sew it together all the way along the top, making sure that the seams underneath stay pressed over to the side that you pressed them. Then press to set the seam and press to fold it upwards, and that's strip 9. Now we're going to make strip 10. This has the star rectangle attached to it. So you need to draw a line on the rectangle. So if you measure 2.5 inches in from the left hand side and make a mark, then join that mark to the bottom corner. Now we're going to sew this to strip 10. So place strip 10 so it's vertical like this, and then place the rectangle so it's at right angles to it, so it's forming like an L shape at the top. Make sure that that mark that you've done will match up to the right hand corner of the strip 10 beneath. So you can actually draw the line on with the strip on. I've just measured it for you. Sew along the line just like you did with the square. Press to set the seam. Now fold this rectangle over, making sure that you've got straight lines running across the top and bottom, and then press it. By pressing it like this, you will get a much more even finish than if you cut the seam allowance first, because you can make sure it runs in a straight line. Trim the seam allowance. Now, diagrams are in the instructions for all of these, so if you'd rather follow the diagram, just to be sure you're doing this correct, I've put all of the diagrams in so you can see where to stitch these. Then take your block and sew strip 10 into place on the right hand side so that that rectangle is in the top right hand corner, and that is now forming part of a star point. Place it right sides facing. Now, although when we did the whole blocks, we had the seams of the block uppermost, when you're doing these squares and rectangles, it's best to have this seam uppermost, because this is the one you've just done, and it's important this lays in the right direction. But you can put a pin through the seams below to make sure they stay pressed over when you sew them. Then put all your placement pins in. There's no seam matching with this one. That holds that seam allowance in place. That pin holds that seam allowance in place. And then these hold the raw edges together. Sew strip 10 into place across the top. And then press the seam over to one side. And now to finish the block, take strip 11 and sew that across the bottom just like you did with the whole block. And when you've done that, take strip 12 and sew that to place along the left-hand side. And now your one corner block is finished and will look like this. So there's your star point in the corner. And then repeat this to make 12 one corner blocks in total. And then put those to one side, ready for making the next block. Making a 3-corner block. Join together 8 of the pieces, the centre square in strips 1 to 8, into the block just as you did with the whole block. And then take one strip 9, one strip 10 for a 3-corner block, one strip 11 for a 3-corner block, and one strip 12 for a 3-corner block. You'll also need 3 star squares and 3 star rectangles. So let's start off by making strip 9. And you need 1 star square for this. So on the wrong side of the star square fabric, draw a diagonal line, just like you did with the last block. Now place strip 9 so it's vertical, and place the square at the top so that the diagonal line runs from the bottom left to the top right, and pin it into place. Then sew together along this drawn line. You can refer to the diagram in the instructions if you prefer. Fold the corner over so it meets the corner below. Press. Then trim the seam allowance. So this snowballing the corner method is used throughout all of these blocks. It's the same for each of them. It's just where this corner is placed. Fold it back over, and that's strip 9 complete. So take your centre and 8 joined strips and place 9 at the top with that corner on the left-hand side. Pin it into place, but match up these seams. So put a pin through the top strip 9, 1/4 inch down, and push that pin through the seam 1/4 inch from the top on the strip below. And then you can make sure that the seam matches up exactly. If it doesn't match up totally, it doesn't really matter. With the whole quilt, and once it's quilted, you won't notice. But if you do try to do it at this stage by just putting the pins through, it will help. Make sure that when you sew it and you pin it, that the seams that you've got pressed over to one side below don't get twisted. Sew together and then fold the strip over and press it upwards. So that's strip 9 attached. Now let's take strip 10 for the 3-corner block and a star square. Again, draw a diagonal line on the wrong side from one corner to the other. I use an erasable pen for drawing my diagonal lines. You could do it lightly in pencil if you like. Place strip 10 so it runs vertically and place the square at the bottom so that the diagonal line runs from top left to bottom right. Pin it into place, making sure the raw edges match up as you do, and then sew together along the drawn line. Then the same way as before, fold the corner of the square over to the corner of the strip below, press it, open it up and trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch, and then just press it back into place, only because where you've held it by cutting it, it can pull it out slightly. So just press it back into place. Take your block and sew strip 10 into place so that that square with the corner goes at the bottom. It's really important that you concentrate when you're doing this so that you make sure that you put the squares and the rectangles in the right place, and also that when you join them to the block, they're in the right place. So I would say if you make one whole 3-corner block at a time, then you can have that on your table to refer to when you're making the others. If you watch the video and look at the instructions, you can just follow the diagrams to make sure that you've put the squares and the rectangles in the right corners. And then once you've done that, it's really easy to then follow one block to do the next. Place pins in all the way along again. It's the same way, matching up raw edges and making sure that the seam allowances below that you pin over to the side that you've pressed them so that they don't get twisted. And then sew this strip into place and press it over to one side. So there's 9 and 10 attached. Now take strip 11 for the 3-corner block. And this time you'll need a square and a rectangle. So start off with the square and draw a diagonal line from one corner to the opposite corner. And place that on strip 11. Have strip 11 lying horizontally, and then this square goes in the right hand side so that that diagonal line runs from bottom left to top right. And sew it into place. And then with the rectangle, if you place that on top, so the rectangle needs to be facing upwards, you can actually see through this fabric, so you can mark where it meets on the top left hand corner, can you see? Or you can measure 2.5 inches up if you prefer, but because you can see through this fabric, I just place it on top and then draw that line so it runs from the top left to the bottom right, and then place it back on top of strip 11. So the rectangle is facing upwards and the line goes from top left to bottom right. So you can either measure to mark this line, or you can just place it on top if you can see through. Sew along the line. Once you've sewn both of these, press the square over so that the corners meet up, fold it back and cut off the seam allowance, so you're cutting through just the 2 layers, and press to hold it back in place. And then with the rectangle, fold it over so that the lines, so it's in a straight line, so that rectangle is running in a straight line parallel in line with the strip 11. Cut off the seam allowance and then just press it back into place. Now take your block, make sure it's the right way up, and place strip 11 along the bottom so that the square's on the left and the rectangle is on the right. Place it right sides facing along the bottom. Then pin it into place at one end. Now you can see here You don't need to do any seam matching because it's just a strip underneath. But I still always place a pin where that seam is because I'm going to make sure I hold the seam that's joined the square on. I pin it down, and then it just helps that when you're sewing that won't get twisted. And then pin it all the way along, matching the raw edges and making sure the seam allowance below stays facing the way that you pressed it. And sew it into place. So that's strip 11 done. So finally we just need to do strip 12. Strip 12 for the 3-corner block has 2 rectangles. So place it so it's vertical because that's the way it'll be attached to the block. Place 1 rectangle at the top so it's facing to the left, and you can see beneath to mark the corner, or you can measure the 2.5 inches, but I just mark it because I can see it. Draw a line from that point from the top left to the bottom right. Again, if you prefer, you can refer to the diagram in the instructions, so just double check that you've got your rectangles facing the right way and your drawn lines are facing the right way. Once you've done 1 or 2 of these blocks, you'll find this really easy. Place the other rectangle at the bottom. Again, it's facing towards the left, just like the one at the top. So mark where it meets the strip at the bottom, and this time draw your diagonal line from the top left to the bottom right, so you can see that the diagonal lines are coming from the centre of the strip and going outwards. Just double check against the diagram to be sure that you've got them in the right places. And then sew along the drawn lines. Press it so that the rectangle is running in a straight line with strip 12, and then cut off the seam allowance. And then repeat that on the other side. Press it so that the rectangle is in a straight line. Trim the seam allowance. And press it back into place. Now take your block, make sure it's facing the right way up, and sew strip 12 to the left-hand side, just like you've done before. I always like to place it like this, so I know it's in the right place, and then I can sew it into place. So place it right sides facing. There's no seam matching to do with this one, so just pin it into place at one end and then pin it into place at the other end. And then just arrange it so that the raw edges are matching. Again, you can use the method of pushing a pin into your board and then pulling the fabric slightly to make sure that it sits evenly across the block below. Put your pins so the raw edges match, and then so that the seam allowances above and below are facing in the direction that you pressed them, and then sew it together. Once you've done that, your 3-corner block is now finished, and you can see you've got stars in 3 corners. Repeat this to make 8 3-corner blocks in total. Then put these to one side ready for the next block. Making a 4-corner block. So join together your centre square and 8 strips 1 to 8. That you've cut for your blocks, and then you will need 1 strip 9, 1 strip 10 for a 4-corner block, a strip 11 for a 4-corner block, and a strip 12 for a 4-corner block. You'll also need 4 star squares and 4 star rectangles. So let's start off by making strip 9. So for strip 9, you'll need 2 star squares. So just as before, on the wrong side Of each of the squares, draw a diagonal line that runs from one corner to the opposite corner. Now with strip 9 facing horizontally, because that's how it will be attached to the block, place one square on either side. The one on the left, the diagonal line needs to go from bottom left to top right, and the one on the right, the diagonal line needs to go from top left to bottom right. Make sure the raw edges are matching, so you can see that the diagonal lines are facing from the outside to the centre. And you'll see this always happens when you're attaching two star squares or rectangles to a strip. So sew together along these drawn lines. Then press the square over so that the corners meet up, just like you've done with all of the others. Open it up, trim the seam allowances. And then press them back over into place. Take the strips that you've already joined together in the block and place strip 9 across the top so you can see here where the squares are going into the corners. Place it right sides facing and making sure that the seam matches up. Push a pin a 1/4 of an inch down from the seam where the square is and into the seam below, and then do that on the other side. That will just make sure that the seams where you've joined the star squares in match the seams below for just a neater finish. And keeping that pin in place, place a pin through the two fabrics. Pin together at either end. Make sure the raw side and top edges are matching up. Pin together there and remove that pin, and then pin at the end, and then pop a pin in across the centre. Just keep the raw edges even while you're sewing. Now sew strip 9 in place. Then press to set the seam and press the seam so it's facing outwards. Now we can do strip 10. So take strip 10 and you will need a square and a rectangle for this. So start off with the square by drawing a diagonal line from one corner to the opposite corner. Place strip 10 so it's facing vertically because this is how it will be attached to the block, and place the square at the bottom so that the diagonal line goes from top left to bottom right, and pin it into place. And you can sew it now, but I prefer to pin and sew them at the same time. So place the rectangle so it's facing towards the right, and mark where the top right hand corner of the strip meets the rectangle, or you can measure the 2.5 inches along, but because this fabric's see-through like before, I'm just going to mark it because I can see through. And then draw your diagonal line so it goes from top right to bottom left, making sure that the rectangle is facing right and that the raw edges on the top and the left hand side of the rectangle are matching up with the strip 10. And then sew into place along your drawn diagonal lines. Fold the rectangle over, making sure that it runs straight with the fabric strip beneath, and fold the corner of the square over so it matches with the corner of the strip. Open out to trim the seam allowance. I think it's much easier to pin and sew the square and the rectangle on at the same time. It's just easier to get your placement correct. And then just press them over again. Now take your block and placing it so it's facing the right direction. Place strip 10 down the right hand side so that the square's at the bottom and the rectangle's at the top, just the way that you sew them into place to start with. That's why I always place my strips facing the direction they're going onto the block, and then sew the squares or the rectangles into place. It's much easier then when you sew it to the block because you remember which way everything's facing. I think it makes more logical sense if you do it in this way, then you don't get mixed up about what goes where. As before, pin together at either end. And then put pins through where you've got seams so that you make sure that they stay pressed over in the right direction. If you always get into the habit of doing this, you'll find that you'll get less twisted seams, which just gives you a more even quilt when you've finished it. Sew this together and then press it over to one side, and that's strip 10 attached. Now we're going to make strip 11. So take your strip 11 for the 4-corner block, and you need a square and a rectangle again. Place this strip horizontally, as this is how it will be attached to the block. The square goes on the right hand side and the rectangle goes on the left hand side. The rectangle needs to be facing upwards. Draw a diagonal line going from the top right to the bottom left, so you can see the diagonal lines always go from the out to the centre when you're attaching two like this. So mark where the strip below meets the rectangle, or measure 2.5 inches up, and draw a line from the top left to the bottom right. So you can see as you make more and more of the blocks, it becomes a lot easier. The first time you're having to look at the diagrams and follow the video, but after a while you understand the process, that these diagonal lines always go into the centre, and then you just need to double check whether the rectangles go upwards or downwards. And then pin them into place and sew along the diagonal lines. Press them as you normally do so that the corner of the square matches up with the corner of the strip, and so that the rectangle runs in a straight line from the strip. Always do this pressing before you cut, because sometimes, because fabric can stretch, depending on how hot your iron is and whether you're using steam, it can stretch out of place. So if you always make sure it's pressed following the fabric beneath before you trim it off, you will get a straighter strip. Now that's strip 11 finished. Just give a little press. Take your block, making sure it's facing the right way up, and place strip 11 along the bottom so that the square is on the left and the rectangle is on the right. Place it right sides facing and then pin it into place. There's no seam matching up for this. For all of these log cabin blocks, even when you're attaching these stars, squares and rectangles, there's only a little bit of seam matching, but not a lot. It's only on a few of the strips, which is why I think log cabin is so popular, because you don't have to do all the seam matching. And then push your placement pins in just to hold those seam allowances so they're facing the right direction. And then sew the two strips together and press it over. So that's strip 11 attached. Now finally, let's do strip 12. So you need strip 12 for a 4-corner block and 2 rectangles. So place strip 12 so it's running vertically, because obviously this is going to go on the left-hand side of the block, and place your 2 rectangles, one at the top and one at the bottom, so that they're facing towards the left. Mark where the strip meets the fabric below. So on the bottom edge you can see I've marked where it's the fabric below, or you can measure it. And then draw a diagonal line. Again, the diagonal line will be going from the centre outwards. And then with the top strip, I'll pin that into place first. Then with the top strip, the diagonal line needs to go from the top left to the bottom right. So again, mark or measure where the strip meets it beneath. And pin it in, draw the diagonal line, pin it into place, and then sew along these lines. So you can see the lines go from the centre outwards. Once they're sewn into place, fold the rectangles over so they run in straight lines from the strip and press. Trim the seam allowance. And then just press the strip to make it nice and flat. Now take your whole block, make sure it's facing the right way up, and place this strip 12 on the left hand side so that the lines go from the centre outwards. Fold it over so it's right sides facing. Again, there is a diagram of the finished block in the instructions, so when you're making your first block, just double check against the diagram at each stage just to make sure that these 4 strips are sewn in the right place and you've got the squares and the rectangles in the right place. Then you can keep your block on your table to use for reference. But you will find it quicker and easier as you go. The first block you have to concentrate to make sure everything's in the right place, and after that the whole system makes more sense because these squares and rectangles form the points of the stars. And you have these 4 corner blocks, there are only 4 of them, but they go in the centre of the quilt and they join up with the 3 corners and the 1 corner blocks to create the stars that are on the quilt. Sew together. Once you've pinned it, then you sew together. But this is a really simple way of having stars in a design by just cutting off the corners with a plain fabric. Once that's sewn into place, your 4 corner block is now complete and it's got a little star point in each corner. So all you have to do now is repeat this to make 4 corner blocks in total, and you're ready now to start putting your quilt together. Making the quilt top. Once you've finished all the blocks, lay them out on a flat surface, referring to the quilt layout diagram. I've laid them all out on my kitchen floor. I'm just showing you what they look like, all laid out. You can then make sure that you've laid them out and all the stars match. And then I have labelled the first block in each row. So there's block 1. Row 1, and then join all the blocks together in that row. So if you pile them up in the order with the block that's first on top and then second, third, fourth below, then you can make sure you join them together in the correct order. So create all your rows in the same way. So there's row 1, here's row 2. Because I've labelled them, I know that the block that's on the left, the one that I had on my pile on the top, is the one that's on the left. Once you've made all your rows, join them together. I like to join row 1 to row 2, then 3 to 4, then 5 to 6, and then I join the pairs together. It's just less bulk when you're joining it all together like this, if you join them in pairs and then join all the pairs to make the whole thing. So once you've joined them all together, I've now finished my quilt top. So I've pressed the seams open and flat where I've joined the blocks and when I've joined the rows. You can see now all of those 1 corner, 3 corner and 4 corner blocks that you created all joined together to make stars. You've got one big star in the centre, and then you've got stars that go around the outer edges of the inner section of the quilt. So your whole quilt top is now finished and beautiful. Binding the quilt. The instructions tell you how many strips to cut from the fabric to use for your binding fabric. So I've cut them all into shorter lengths, but refer to the instructions for size details. And I'm going to join them all together, alternating the colours and the prints to get a scrappy binding which matches beautifully with the quilt. So to join them together, take one strip and take the next strip, decide what order you're going to put them in. Place 2 strips right sides facing at right angles so the top and the side raw edges match up. Then sew together from one top corner to the bottom right corner, and repeat that with all of them. You need to trim the seam allowances and press them open, and then you will have your whole binding strip like this. For more detailed instructions and a video tutorial and a free PDF download, visit the Amber Makes website, and it will explain in detail with more of a tutorial of how to do this. Fold your binding in half with wrong sides together, as I want to make a double fold binding on my quilt. So my quilt is all now quilted and sewn together around the edges with all the backing fabric and the wadding. So all I have to do now is bind it. I like to bind mine so the binding, I can top stitch it into place. So with the quilt, with the backing fabric right sides up, place the binding strip matching the raw edges all the way along. Sew it together all the way around. Don't forget, the free tutorial will explain this, to start stitching 4 inches from the top so you've got room for joining. Mitre the corners, and then when you've sewn it into place, you can fold the binding over to the right side and top stitch in place. And now your beautiful Barn Gazing quilt is finished. It's a beautiful heirloom quilt that you will treasure forever.